Hello and welcome to Slow Sleep Stories. Today's story is titled, I Am the Caretaker, and every night at 2:13, something moves in the cellar below. It follows the quiet, mysterious nights of a caretaker named Samuel, who tends to an old estate in rural Vermont where strange sounds come alive after midnight. Thanks. Before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's start this journey together tonight. Samuel pulled his coat tighter against the crisp October breeze as he stepped off the bus in the small Vermont town of Brattleboro. The late afternoon sun filtered softly through the turning maple leaves, casting a golden glow on the quiet streets. Samuel had always loved this time of year, the gentle rustle of the trees, the scent of wood smoke drifting from chimneys, and the way the air felt clean, as if the world were taking a deep breath before winter. At 50, Samuel carried the calm of a man used to solitude, his graying hair neatly trimmed, and his eyes a gentle shade of hazel that seemed to observe the world with quiet curiosity. He wasn't the type to rush, nor was he easily unsettled. Yet, as he approached the winding driveway that led to Blackwood Estate, a faint chill tickled the back of his neck. The house rose before him like a storybook, vision its weathered stone, walls cloaked in ivy, tall windows reflecting the amber light. Built in 1887, Blackwood had long been the pride of the area, though it had sat empty for decades until recently. The caretaker's job, Samuel had been told, was to keep the estate safe and sound until the new owners decided its fate. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and pine needles, and somewhere nearby an owl hooted softly. Samuel felt the weight of the silence settle around him like a thick blanket. Inside, the house creaked with age, floorboards whispered beneath his boots, and dust motes danced lazily in the fading light. The wooden beams overhead groaned as if sharing old secrets. Samuel moved carefully through the rooms, noting the heavy oak furniture, faded wallpaper, and the intricate carvings on the mantelpiece down the hall. A sturdy door with iron hinges caught his eye. It led to the cellar. The lock was old but secure, a rusty key hanging on a nearby hook. He wondered what stories lay beneath the floorboards that night. As the wind sighed softly outside, Samuel settled into the old armchair by the fireplace, a thick quilt draped over his legs. The house felt alive in its own slow rhythm, and he welcomed the quiet hum. A soft chuckle escaped him as he remembered a joke from his grandmother about old houses. They're just like your relatives, full of creaks and secrets, but always worth the visit. He sipped his chamomile tea, feeling the warmth seep in. Outside, the moon cast silver light through the trees, and somewhere deep in the forest, a fox barked once before silence returned. Samuel's eyes grew heavy, and he let himself drift into sleep, unaware that the house was waiting for midnight. The clock in the hallway chimed softly as midnight passed. Samuel lay awake, wrapped in the stillness of the old house. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something else, something older, like forgotten stories, tucked deep into the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, rustling dry leaves along the gravel driveway. His eyes flicked to the antique clock on the mantel. Its face was cracked, but the hands moved steadily toward 13 a.m., a time he hadn't yet learned held any particular significance. The house was quiet, except for the gentle creaking of the wooden frame settling in the night. Then, precisely as the clock ticked past 2:13, a soft sound drifted from below the cellar. It was subtle at first, like the faintest scrape against stone. Samuel's heart skipped a beat, but his breath stayed slow and steady. The sound repeated, a gentle thud, then a shuffle, as if someone or something was moving just beneath the floorboards. He sat up, listening intently. The wind pressed against the windows, and for a moment he imagined the house itself breathing, alive with secrets. The noise came again, rhythmic and slow, not harsh or alarming, but unmistakably there. Samuel stood and moved quietly to the heavy door that led to the cellar. He pressed his ear against it, hearing only the faint echo of the cellar's cool stone walls. The lock held fast. No one could have opened it without the key hanging in the kitchen. A nervous smile touched his lips. Probably just the house settling, he whispered to himself. Or a raccoon looking for a midnight snack. He remembered a story his uncle once told him about old houses, how they sometimes held on to sounds, like memories trapped in wood and stone. Old houses aren't haunted, his uncle had joked, they're just very forgetful. With a soft chuckle, Samuel returned to his chair and pulled the quilt tighter. Outside, the moon dipped behind a cloud, and the night seemed to deepen. The sounds didn't return, but the sense of something just beyond hearing lingered. He closed his eyes, letting the quiet lull him toward sleep again. The house exhaled a long sigh, and the wind sang a soft lullaby through the trees. The next morning, golden sunlight spilled through the lace curtains, casting gentle patterns on the worn wooden floor. Samuel stretched as he sipped his coffee, the warmth soothing his quiet nerves. The mystery of the cellar still hovered in his mind, but daylight made the house seem less daunting, more like an old friend sharing a secret. Curious to learn more, Samuel decided to visit the local library in Brattleboro. The small building smelled of polished wood and old paper, with sunbeams dancing across rows of books. He approached the historical archives, where a kind librarian guided him to dusty records about Blackwood Estate. Flipping through yellowed pages, Samuel discovered the story of Jeremiah Blackwood, the estate's original owner. Jeremiah had been a reclusive inventor in the early 1900s, known for his curious gadgets and quiet demeanor. Rumors whispered that he disappeared one stormy night in 1922, leaving behind unfinished experiments and unanswered questions. One entry caught Samuel's eye, mention of a secret project hidden deep within the cellar, a device designed to capture sound and light in ways no one understood. The cellar, it seemed, held more than just old tools and cobwebs. Samuel felt a thrill of excitement mixed with unease. The house, with its creaking floors and locked cellar door, was more alive than he'd first thought. The inventor's shadow seemed to linger in the corners, a faint echo of a man chasing mysteries beyond his time. He smiled softly, remembering a joke he'd heard about inventors. They're just like cats, always chasing the impossible, and sometimes knocking over the lamp. The thought eased the tension in his chest, with a few notes scribbled in his journal. Samuel returned to the estate, the afternoon sun warming his back. The house awaited him, patient and full of stories yet to be told. As evening settled, he prepared for another quiet night, wondering what secrets the cellar might reveal next. As twilight settled over Blackwood Estate, a gentle fog began to curl through the towering oaks surrounding the property. The house, bathed in soft orange hues from the setting sun, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Samuel moved slowly through the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner of roasted vegetables and fresh bread, the smells mingling warmly in the air. The quiet of the evening was comforting, yet beneath it, a subtle tension whispered like a breeze through the cracks. Samuel had started to notice small things, tools slightly out of place, footprints in the dust near the cellar door, and the faintest trace of cold air slipping beneath the threshold. These signs weren't alarming, but they told a story of movement in the stillness. After dinner, he sat near the fireplace, the flames casting playful shadows on the walls. His thoughts drifted back to the cellar, the locked door now feeling less like a barrier and more like a threshold to the unknown. He remembered a joke his friend once told him: "Ghosts are just roommates who never moved out." A soft creak from below pulled his attention. The house settled again, but this time it felt different, like something was stirring quietly beneath the floorboards. Samuel's gaze turned toward the cellar door. He could almost sense a presence there, as if the house itself was trying to tell him something. Curiosity mixed with calm resolve. He stood and ran his fingers over the rough wood of the door, feeling the cool metal of the lock beneath. The cellar wasn't just a storage space. It was a place alive with echoes of the past. As the clock ticked closer to 2:13 a.m., Samuel prepared himself for the familiar sounds. Tonight, he promised himself, he would listen, not just with his ears, but with his heart. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The house breathed around him, steady and slow, waiting for the night's quiet secrets to unfold. At exactly 2:12 a.m., Samuel stood in the hallway, candle in hand. The flickering light cast soft glows against the wallpaper, illuminating faded patterns of vines and birds. The air was cool and still, as if the whole house held its breath. With him, the second hand on the antique clock ticked forward to 13. There it was again, a gentle shuffling, barely audible, like someone dragging a boot across loose gravel. It came from behind the cellar door, low and deliberate. Samuel didn't flinch this time. He knelt down and placed his ear to the hardwood floor. Scrape, pause, thud. There was no mistaking it. Something was moving in the cellar. He didn't open the door that night. Instead, he returned to his journal, recording the time, the sounds, and what he'd noticed, the distinct rhythm, the way the sound traveled along the floorboards, and how it stopped just as suddenly as it started, never continuing past to 15. The next day, he returned to the library with new purpose. The same kind librarian brought him more articles, personal letters from Jeremiah Blackwood's niece, who mentioned her uncle's obsession with sound and memory. One letter in particular struck him. Uncle believed voices could live on in the vibrations of walls, if only we could hear them. He said the cellar was his archive of echoes. I never dared go down. Samuel's breath caught. Archive of echoes. He began to wonder, was the cellar haunted not by ghosts, but by memory itself? Could the sounds he heard be remnants of Jeremiah's final experiment? That evening, he sat by the fireplace again, candlelight dancing across the pages of the inventor's notes he'd copied from the archive. They were filled with sketches, diagrams of strange, ear-shaped devices, funnels attached to pipes that descended into the cellar, as if listening to the earth itself. Old houses don't forget, Samuel murmured, smiling wryly. They just mumble in their sleep. The wind howled softly outside, and the house creaked back in reply. The clock neared to 13 again. Samuel took a deep breath and, for the first time, slid the key from the kitchen hook. Tomorrow, he would go down. Morning broke softly, with pale light filtering through heavy clouds. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. The sky, a quiet gray blanket stretching across Vermont. Samuel dressed deliberately, thick flannel shirt, jeans, boots in his pocket. The cellar key pressed lightly against his leg, like a heartbeat. The house seemed quieter than usual. Even the floorboards withheld their usual creaks. With one hand resting on the key, he stood before the cellar door. The air felt cooler here, as if the door sealed in not just space, but time. He turned the key. The lock clicked open with a gentle reluctance, like it hadn't moved in years. The door groaned as it swung inward, revealing a steep stairway vanishing into darkness. Dust motes floated in the shaft of light pouring from above. Samuel hesitated, then stepped inside. Each stair groaned beneath him, and the scent of old stone and iron filled his nose, earthy, damp, and tinged with something metallic. The cellar was larger than he expected, with low stone arches and shelves filled with jars, tools, and yellowed books. The walls were lined with strange devices, rusting brass horns, mesh screens, long copper tubes coiling into the stone dot at the far end. A wooden workbench sat beneath a small dust-covered window. Above it, a cracked photograph of Jeremiah Blackwood stared out, sharp eyes, a crooked body, and a faint, proud smile. A placard beneath the frame read, "Every sound has its shadow." Samuel ran his hand along the bench. Tucked behind it, he found what looked like a wooden phonograph, but instead of a needle and record, it had wires that disappeared into the wall. On the floor nearby, he saw faint footprints in the dust. Footprints that hadn't been there the night before. He froze. They were fresh and small, barefoot. His breath caught. A soft rustling came from the far corner. Samuel turned slowly, holding his candle high. It flickered, shadows shifting on the stones. There, in the corner, stood a little rocking chair. It creaked gently, though no one sat in it. A sudden laugh bubbled from his throat, half nerves, half wonder. "Really? A haunted rocking chair," he whispered. "Classic." He stepped closer. On the chair was a folded paper, thick and yellowed. He unfolded it carefully. It was another letter, signed simply with a B, written in elegant, looping handwriting. "The cellar must never be silent. Without sound, the memory fades." Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, though no windows were open. The candle flickered violently, and then click. The phonograph device lit up with a dim, amber glow. A voice, soft and crackling, filled the room. "Jeremiah, is that you?" Samuel stumbled back, heart pounding. The voice was a woman's, fragile and searching. It repeated twice, then fell silent. The cellar returned to stillness. For a moment, Samuel just stood there, the weight of the house pressing down like a thick wool blanket. Whatever this place was, it wasn't simply haunted, it was listening, always. He turned and climbed the stairs, locking the door behind him. Above ground, the rain had stopped. The world continued quietly, but in his mind, the voice lingered, delicate, trembling, and impossibly alive. The following days passed in slow, measured rhythm. Samuel kept his routines, the gardening, the cleaning, the walks through the misty woods, but everything was now touched by an invisible thread pulling him back to the cellar. He didn't return immediately. He needed time to think. Instead, he studied the notes he'd taken from the phonograph's activation, the strange copper wiring, the footprints. He even traced the rocking chair's history through the inventory logs. It had belonged to Jeremiah's sister, Beatrice Blackwood, who died young. No records of her burial site existed, just a faint, half-written obituary tucked in the local archives. It ended with the line, "She is survived by her brother and the house that hears all." It wasn't just an experiment. This was grief, etched into stone and wires. Samuel returned to the cellar 3 nights later. The door opened more easily this time, as if the house had granted him passage. He brought a portable recorder and left his phone upstairs. This felt sacred, like a chapel beneath the earth. When he reached the bottom, the candlelight again revealed the rocking chair. This time, it didn't move. The phonograph was quiet, but something new lay on the workbench. A locket, long tarnished but intact, wrapped in a faded ribbon. Samuel opened it gently. Inside were two photos, one of Jeremiah, and the other, a child, with wide-set eyes and soft curls. On the back, scratched faintly in ink, B. 1882 to 1890. Beatrice had died at 8 years old. Samuel sat on the cold stone floor and whispered to the cellar. "Is this what you've been trying to say all these years?" His voice trembled. "You didn't want her to be forgotten." A quiet sound answered him, a soft clinking, like glass tapping wood. The phonograph clicked on once more. This time, the voice was Jeremiah's, strong, though strained with age. "This house is her memory. If you hear this, remember her. Say her name." Then silence. Samuel swallowed hard. He realized what had stirred in the cellar all those nights. It wasn't a haunting, it was a reaching out, a persistent hope someone might finally listen. He lit another candle and placed it on the workbench beside the locket. "I hear you," he whispered. That night, for the first time in weeks, there was no noise at 2:13, only the steady ticking of the clock, and the soft exhale of an old house. Finally at peace, if only for a little while, Samuel returned upstairs, his footsteps gentle, and sat by the fireplace. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. Inside, the house stood still and calm. The final week of Samuel's stay arrived like the last page of a well-worn journal, quiet, inevitable, heavy with meaning. Morning mist lingered a little longer over the trees, and the air tasted faintly of wood smoke and whetstone. He began packing in small, thoughtful steps, folding clothes into neat piles, and setting aside a few mementos: a dog-eared notebook, a pinecone from the hill near the orchard, and the now-polished locket that had once rested in the shadows of the cellar. But even as he prepared to leave, something within him remained rooted. Every creak of the old floorboards felt like a goodbye. Every flicker of light across the parlor rug felt like a memory not yet made. His final night came quietly. He lit the fireplace as the first stars appeared, casting the room in a soft amber glow. Outside, a low wind drifted through the trees, and inside, Samuel sat in the old rocking chair by the window, with a mug of cinnamon tea cradled between his palms. The candle on the mantel danced gently. He'd kept the cellar locked since that last night, the locket and its voice now resting on the writing desk upstairs, beside a letter he'd written for the next caretaker should the house choose one. At precisely 13 a.m., Samuel opened his eyes. The house was silent, but not empty. He rose and moved slowly to the cellar door, not out of fear, but in answer. He didn't unlock it. He simply pressed his hand against the wood. A quiet warmth seemed to rise through his fingers, like the echo of a hand pressed back on the other side. "I'm going now," he said softly. "You're not forgotten." From the parlor, the phonograph clicked once, not the one in the cellar, the one upstairs. Samuel's breath caught. He moved through the hallway, past the grandfather clock, up the narrow steps where the air thinned with memory. The phonograph rested beside his bed, dusty but untouched for months. The needle sat still, the switch unmoved, yet it played. Faintly soft as breath he heard it, a girl's laughter. It lasted only a few seconds, a trill of joy, rising like sunlight through clouds, then gone. He didn't move. He didn't need to. In that moment, Samuel understood. The house wasn't haunted by sorrow. It held it, preserved it, kept it warm in its walls, like an ember that never died. The cellar, the rocking chair, the voices, They were all threads in a single tapestry, woven by longing memory and the quiet refusal to let go. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the wooden floors as he locked the front door behind him. The house didn't resist. As he reached the end of the long gravel drive, he looked back once. The curtains in the second-floor window shifted slightly. Perhaps it was the wind. Perhaps it was Beatrice, waving. He smiled, tucked the locket into his coat pocket, and stepped into the waiting morning. Good night.